second live event of this series, shall we call Power, Odd and Scary Beast. To launch the Collection 2, a volume which offers a selection of 5 years of interviews of Telos publication Primo Piano Scanacci, we decided to discuss with some of the key contributors of our publication about one of the most controversial topics of all time, power. Today, our guest is Jason Brennan, one of the most interesting and controversial contemporary political philosophers and author of the best-selling Against Democracy, which room Marco Sonsini and I will talk about the power of voting. Before getting started, I'd like to leave the floor to Jason to allow him to briefly introduce himself. Jason?
Hi, thanks for having me today. My name is Jason Brennan. I'm a political philosopher who works at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I'm the father of 2 children. I'm happily married. I have a very extensive guitar collection, and my interests also include various sports and other things. So thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this introduction. And the first question we would like to ask you about is the reasons for the widespread disaffection among voters that we observe nearly everywhere in Western democracies. Most of us tend to think of the vote as not only a right, but a duty. But when an actual election comes, 30 to 50% of citizens eligible to vote do not show up. And the turnout tends to be particularly low in local elections. So what is the reason for this in your view? Is it disaffection with politicians or distrust of democracy overall or anything else?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that there's any one particular causal factor that's determined it. I think we have a confluence of negative things going on. And for one, we should start by saying there wasn't really a golden age of democracy where everything was working well. If you interview people from 50 years ago or 60 years ago, you find that people are very worried about the quality of democracy, the quality of political discourse, and so on. It is true that in general, you see participation rates lowering around the world. And that could reflect, to some degree, complacency or satisfaction. It could be the view that maybe I don't need to participate quite as much because things seem to be going okay. Whereas, say, shortly after World War II, I think there was a lot of energy to make sure democracy worked, and people were worried about whether it was going to work in many countries, and there might have been higher rates of participation for that reason, in part because many of these rights were just recently acquired by many people, and so they felt the strong need to exercise them. So I don't think the fact that we have lower participation should always be regarded as a negative. Sometimes it reflects a degree of satisfaction with what's going on. But that said, there are a lot of negative trends. General support for democracy is lower now than it was in the past. When you interview people, their tendency to think authoritarianism is a good alternative to democracy is higher now in the past. There's weaker support for liberal free speech rights than there was in the past. The degree of polarization that we witness in almost every country is higher. People are more divided politically than they used to be. They're more intolerant of one another. So for instance, say in the 1960s, if you interviewed people from any country of any political party and asked them, would you be willing to marry someone of a different political party? Would you be okay with your children marrying someone from a different political party? Are you willing to work in an environment where you're surrounded by people who have different political beliefs than you? Overwhelmingly, people said all of those things were fine. Nowadays, when you interview people, overwhelmingly, they wish to live in a political bubble. They want to isolate themselves from those with whom they disagree. They don't want to talk to them. And I think that this leads to pervasive distrust of one another. And it leads to people thinking that the system must be rigged. And so a very common thing that you see around the world is whenever my party wins, that's proof that the system was working. And whenever the other party wins, obviously there is some big conspiracy that explains how corruption led to this outcome. Democracy has failed. And so people don't really tend to believe that they can ever lose fairly anymore. So I do think that there is this kind of pervasive polarization, mutual distrust, mutual animosity. And when we try to measure that, we do in fact see that that's getting worse. And that undermines people's support for democracy and makes them more inclined to think we need to have an authoritarian strongman come in and fix the problem.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned polarization. You said that But voters are much more polarized than they used to be decades ago. And this brings us to another topic that we would like to explore with you, which is the factors that have a potential to influence voters' behavior. We tend to think of the vote as a rational process, or we tend to portray the vote as a rational process by means of which every individual citizen evaluates the policies of all political parties, of all candidates, and then selects the party or the candidate based on the policies that suit his or her interests best. But is this really the case? Do you think this is really the case, or do voters behave otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think most people around the world, most journalists, most citizens, when you ask them how democracy works, will tell you a theory that I sometimes like to call the primary school theory of democracy. But I'm going to call it that because around the world in most democracies, sometime around your 6th year of education, this is what your school system teaches you. And unfortunately, this theory is wrong. But let's go over what the theory is and then explain why it's wrong. So the theory says that this is what voters do. They start off by having a set of interests, the things that they care about. It doesn't have to just be their own self. They might care about the environment or justice or racial issues or poverty or whatever it is, but they have concerns, things that they care about. Then the next step is they go and learn how the world works. They discover what politics is able to do. They learn how the economy works. They learn things about global affairs and the intersection of trade between countries. And they come to have a theory of what the world is like. And as a result of their values and their understanding of how the world works, they form something like an ideology, a stable set of political beliefs about which policies are good or bad. The next step, the third step, is then you go and you look for the political party that best matches your political beliefs, and you vote for them. So maybe if I were in Italy, I'd vote for like your Liberal Party. Maybe my colleagues might vote for like the Social Democratic Party or something like that. And everybody supposedly does that. And at the same time, the parties want to win power. And so they try to offer political policies that will be amenable to the vast majority, or at least a sizable portion of voters. Then as a result, because everyone is doing this, we're all voting on the basis of our beliefs, which reflect our interests, and the parties are trying to promote policies which will get us to vote for them. When we vote, we end up electing a party or a candidate or a coalition of parties which reflect, if not the majority, at least a wide percentage of people roughly in the middle of the country. And now that those parties are in power, they will try to implement the policies that they promised us. And so if this were all true, what would happen is democracy would convert popular opinion into power. It would convert people's interests into power. And finally, the last step of this theory is if they do a bad job, if the elected candidates, if the parties that we elect do a poor job, we will punish them come the next election by voting them out. We will keep track of how well they do, and we'll remove them if they do a bad job. If they do a good job, we will reward them by re-electing them. Unfortunately, we have very strong evidence that almost every single step of this theory is incorrect. So it is true that voters have interests and things that they're concerned about, but then they, for the most part, don't go and learn how the world works. They know very little about the empirics of any of the social sciences. They know basically nothing about economics, nothing about public policy, nothing about political science, nothing about foreign affairs. There's different levels from different countries and so on. But generally speaking, as long as we've been measuring what voters know, they've been incredibly ignorant. And even with the invention of smartphones, where we now have access to all the world's information instantly, people still haven't learned anything. Further, and maybe more disturbingly, when you examine why people choose a political party, it rarely has anything to do with ideology. And the reason for that is, overwhelmingly, most people do not actually have any kind of stable political preferences or policy preferences. When you survey them and ask them a question, what do you think about this? They'll give you an answer on the spot when they're surveyed. But if you ask that same person that same question a week later, a month later, a year later, they'll give you totally different answers, and they won't even know that they've changed their mind. And this has been known for 60, 70 years. Overwhelmingly, voters don't have ideology. Maybe only something like 15 out of 100 typical voters in a modern democracy has anything like stable policy preferences. So you might wonder why they vote then. Why do they pick this party over another? Because most voters always vote for the same party. And the biggest theory about this, it's often called the realist theory of democracy. There's a very good book called Democracy for Realists that you can read that will provide some of the evidence for this. It's kind of like sports fandom. So I'm originally from the Boston area of the United States. So I'm a fan of all of the Boston sports teams. Why? It wasn't as though when I was young, I looked around and tried to figure out which were the best teams and pick those. I did that is because that's what you do if you're from Boston. And if I wear, say a Boston Celtics shirt or a New England Patriots shirt, that tells other people I'm one of them, and they're more likely to be my friend, more likely to go out with me, more likely to partner with me in business. They treat me well. Something similar happens with politics. Different identity groups. It could be college professor as an identity. It could be Boston Irish Catholic as an identity. Get attached to different political parties for largely arbitrary historical reasons. And then once that happens, people will try to demonstrate that they belong to that group by voting over and over again for that same party as a sort of expensive signal of their fidelity to the group. And when they do that, they get all sorts of social rewards. So that's pretty much why people are voting, which means that for the most part, when we have an election, it's not reflecting the will of the people. It's not just there isn't the will of the people as a whole, but overwhelmingly, the majority of people who are voting are not voting because they endorse what the candidate wants to do, because they even know what the candidate wants to do, because they agree with the policies. We survey them, we find they don't know what the candidates want. They don't really care about them. They just will kind of go along with whatever the party says. They're doing it for social reasons. And the reason that they do this is because their votes don't really matter very much. And that's ultimately the explanation. I often like to give this as a thought experiment to sort of illustrate the idea. Imagine you were taking a class at a university with 1,000 students, and the professor at the beginning of the class said, 15 weeks from now, I'm going to give you one exam that's worth 100% of your entire grade. But because I'm an egalitarian, I'm going to average all of your individual scores together, and everyone will get exactly the same score. That's what I'm going to do. Then you can ask, how much do you expect people would study? How much effort do you think they would put into this class? And the answer is they wouldn't study, they wouldn't learn anything, and the average grade would be a failing grade. In fact, this has been done experimentally. That's what happens. And the reason isn't because people are stupid. It's not because they're incompetent. It's because they face perverse incentives. And if you think about what an election is, effectively, it's like having a final exam on economics, politics, foreign affairs, the economy, the accounting, all these other things every few years, all at once, with millions and millions of other students, where your individual input makes almost no difference, which liberates you to treat voting as an expressive activity rather than as an activity where you're trying to push the levers of government one way or versus another.
Well, this is very interesting, but this also has kind of scary implications from our point of view, because when I think of universal suffrage as a principle, I think that probably the best theoretical argument, or the strongest theoretical argument in favor of universal suffrage that I can think of, is that in theory, it allows the interests of the many to prevail over the interests of the few. But what you are saying basically takes this factor out of the equation, because if we accept the notion that voters do not vote according to their interests, then we are probably taking out of the equation the most solid argument to support probably not only democracy but self-government as an overall. So would you agree? Would you agree that this is an implication of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think I would. That doesn't mean that we should therefore dispense with democracy, but it is true that the main argument people give in favor of democracy is probably erroneous. It's based upon empirical presuppositions about voter behavior, which we know to be false. So that doesn't mean that democracy does not respond to the interest of the many. When we go to measure how well do different kinds of government respond to the interest of the many, we do in general find that overall, more democratic countries do more to promote the interests of their people than less democratic countries. I don't want to say it's simply a linear relationship, more democracy, more promotion of interest. It probably kind of tails off at a certain point. So a very good book you can read about this would be called Why Nations Fail by Darren Etchemoglu and James Robinson. And then there's another very good book called 10% Less Democracy, which by Garrett Jones, which critiques some of the coding of the way that they measure this. But part of what goes on in democracies is that at the end of the day, governments cannot perform too badly. They still have to perform somewhat well, or at some point the people will rise up and overthrow them. And that might be enough to explain why you basically never see famines in democracy. You don't really see civil war anymore. You don't see a lot of these other problems. So democracies are very good at averting disaster. They're very good at avoiding the excessive downsides of government. But effectively, this is the puzzle that we have when it comes to political participation. If you concentrate power in the hands of a small number of people, you now give them a strong incentive to think very carefully about how they're going to use that power, right? And they're likely to be more rational about it, to think more, to have more information. However, because the power is concentrated in the hands of the few, they're likely to use that power on behalf of their own interest at the expense of others. And that's, in fact, what we see. When you spread power out among the many, you now disincentivize the majority of people from thinking carefully about the exercise of their power, because their individual slice, we're not talking about slices of cake, we're talking about crumbs. Your votes just don't matter much. You're Italian, your votes matter more than my votes matter because you have a better voting system than we do, but they still don't matter very much. We all have like small slices of power, so we don't use our power very carefully. However, we're nicer about it because we don't have the incentive to be so selfish. So basically what you get in democracy is sort of nice but dumb. And when you get in more authoritarian systems is mean but smart. The Communist Party of China is mean but smart. And, the Democratic Party of the United States is dumb but nice. That's kind of what we have to choose between.
Well, actually, we were a little bit flattered by your statement that we have a better electoral system than you do. Can you tell us why? Because I'm very curious to hear your ideas about that.
Yeah, there's a few reasons. One, there's something you can download. There are a number of indices that are produced every single year trying to evaluate how democratic countries are and how well they're functioning. A really good one to look at is the Economist Intelligence Unit. So the British magazine, The Economist, has a research unit that every year produces an index of how democratic countries are. Overall, Italy scores lower than the US. Not by very much, but overall. However, one of the main metrics that they use is the quality of the electoral process itself. And the most recent one, let me see if I can call it right here. The most recent score from 2020, Italy gets a 9.58 out of 10, which is incredibly high. So when The Economist ranks Italy low, it's not because they think that the actual electoral process is defective. Votes are widespread, they're counted properly, there's not a lot of fraud. People have high rates they have the high power to vote. It's other things that are going on, like the actual quality of government or the rates of participation or other things that kind of make it go down. Overall, at least in the the electoral process itself, Italy gets a very, very high score compared to almost every other country. So that's part of it. But part of it also is because you have a parallel voting system. You elect some of your members of parliament through first past the post system. You elect others through proportional voting. That means that your vote has a higher probability of making a difference than mine does. Also, just because of the size of the country. So when I vote for president, in the most recent election, according to the most optimistic estimate there was in the literature, I, as a voter in Northern Virginia, I live in the state of Virginia. I work in Washington, D.C., but I live in Virginia. I had something like a 1 in 70 million chance of deciding the election. That's actually pretty high compared to most Americans. When I vote for Congress, I have maybe like about a 1 in 100 million chance of breaking a tie. Because you have a different voting system, you have partially a proportional system. It's about 2/3 of your seats are decided proportionally.
Yes.
Because of that, the chance that your individual vote will actually have an outcome or affect the outcome is much higher than mine. It's still really, really small, but it's much higher. So for that reason, and also one of the nice things about having a proportional voting system is a prediction of having a proportional voting system is that there will be many more parties. So first past the post voting, whoever gets the most votes wins. That statistically predicts that there will be two major parties. If another party rises up, it will replace one of them. There will only be two. And overwhelmingly, that's what you see in countries that use that system. Having a proportional voting system predicts that there will be more parties. one of the good things about having more parties is there's a bigger chance that you as a voter with your individual political beliefs can actually get someone that you agree with. And because there's so many more parties, there's maybe less animosity. So go ahead thinking about this. The French philosopher Voltaire had this theory about religion. He said, when there's only one religion, like say the Catholic Church in 1100 AD, it just dominates and crushes everybody. When there's two religions, one sect of Catholicism and like one sect of Lutheranism, they fight constantly trying to murder each other because all you have to do is crush your rival and then you win. When there's 30 sects of Christianity or 30 versions of a religion, you have no chance. You have to learn to live and let live. You have to learn to get along with others because there's so much diversity. You just can't afford to be like by yourself and isolated. And so that was his kind of theory about why England had less, say, political warfare than, like, say, France in the year 1700. I think there's something like that that's true about politics. In the United States, because there's only two major political parties, the other parties just don't matter. It's kind of like Lutheranism versus Catholicism. We just have to crush the other side and it's over. In some countries like, say, Germany or Italy or Sweden and other places where there's so many political parties, yes, there's animosity, yes, there's distrust, but at the end of the day, you're going to work with and interact with people you disagree with. You're going to be friends with them. And you just have to live with that. And I think that produces, to some degree, a healthier political culture overall.
Well, I think Italy provides a very good example of how the electoral system changes in the electoral system can impact on the political party system. We have changed our electoral system many times. And we've had a purely proportional voting system for decades, which resulted in a political system made up of 5, 6, 7 political parties. And then in the early 90s, we shifted to a first-past-the-post system. And one of the strongest arguments in support of that was that adopting a first-past-the-post system would have helped the Italian political system to evolve into something more similar to an Anglo-Saxon two-party system. That didn't happen, and probably it didn't happen because our first-past-the-post system was a very peculiar one, because it allowed two or more parties to unite and to run together in a coalition supporting one candidate. So this did not provide any incentive to political parties to merge. Instead, it provided a strong incentive to political proliferation, to the creation of small parties with a very strong marginal power in breaking the tie between the two coalitions. So we ended up with two large coalitions, a center-right and a center-left, both made up several parties. And what we have observed in the last years is that when we shifted back to a predominantly proportional system, the number of parties has decreased. And so now we have basically 5 political parties with more than 5% of votes each, and the others are more or less irrelevant. So this is a very good example of how really evil is in the details, and first-past-the-post system does not necessarily translate into a two-party system. So now going back to the topic that we were discussing, the desirability of universal suffrage. So if we assume that universal suffrage is not necessarily desirable, how should we select voters so that when they vote, they actually do so in the best interest of their communities? Should we select voters based on census, which was historically the case in many countries in Europe, or on level of education and knowledge, or is there any other criterion, or should they be selected randomly?
Yeah, great question. There are a number of ideas out there in the literature right now where people are trying. we're aware of this problem, the problem of what's called rational ignorance. We're aware of the problem of what's called rational irrationality, which means it's in voters' interest to just not think very carefully about how they vote. So are there ways of solving this? And here's two proposals we're thinking about. Whether these would really work, we don't know, but they're worth considering. So one proposal is something that I've developed. It's called government by simulated oracle, or alternatively, you can call it enlightened preference voting. And the way that this system would work is, on election day, everybody gets to vote. There is no exclusion. There's no, it's just universal suffrage in the following sense. Everyone's allowed to vote, even your children. There's no reason to exclude them on the system. It'll actually be fine. But when they vote, you do three things. So the first thing you do is you tell us what it is that you want. Whatever the election is about, whether it's a referendum, whether it's about picking a candidate, whether it's about picking a party, whatever it is, you tell us what it is you want. The second thing is you tell us who you are. So you put in your demographic information. Are you employed? What's your racial identity? What's your religious identity? How much money do you make? Where do you live, etc.? Because these factors greatly affect how people vote. In fact, they predominantly affect how people vote. So we now know what the people want and who they are. The third thing that we do is we give them an exam. This exam doesn't determine whether they get to vote or not. It doesn't determine whether their vote counts. Every vote counts. But the exam asks them, say, 30 or 40 questions about politics. It could include the price of milk. It could include the price of olive oil, but it could include things like who is the prime minister, who's the president, which parties are controlling parliament, maybe some facts about the Constitution. Can you identify, say, how much money is spent on different things? What's the unemployment rate? Just that kind of stuff. So we now know who the people are, what they want, and what they know. When you have these three sets of data, you can then statistically estimate what would a demographically identical Italian public have voted for if only it were fully informed. So when we give people the quiz, if it has 40 questions, we can reasonably expect them to get about 15 right on average. That's about it. Depends on what we put on the quiz. But we can simulate what would the Italian public have voted for if it had gotten 40 out of 40. And because we're getting their demographic information, we're eliminating the bias introduced by things like, on average, richer people are more informed than poor people. On average, people in the demographic majority are more informed than people in demographic minorities. We're eliminating all of that bias. We're just measuring the effective information. So it's a way of kind of simulating what would happen if only I could wave a magic wand and transform the country into fully informed voters. So one idea is to do that. And then the big question is, who decides what goes on the quiz? And I have some theories about that. Another proposal that I don't personally defend, but there are other people out there. The Mexican philosopher Claudio Lopez Guerra defends this. Alex Guerrero defends this, and a few other philosophers, is having a lottery system, sortition, just like the Greeks used to have. But the way this would work is, say, we have elections go as normal, as we expect them to go, but then maybe a week before the election takes place, or maybe 3 days before it takes place, we randomly select, say, 20,000 people, and only 20,000 people, and we have them vote, and that's it. They're the only ones allowed to vote, and we don't force them to vote. We maybe pay them to do it. We say, here's 2,000 euros. We're going to pay you to be a voter, and perhaps we have them get together in a hotel room, like like someplace, a forum of some sort, and talk with one another, and then they and only they vote and get to decide the election. Because we select everyone at random, we don't have to worry about there being disparities in which kinds of people turn out. In fact, this system, randomly selecting 20,000 people, would lead to make it so that the actual voters are demographically more similar to the electorate at large than what we see under voluntary voting systems. Because we're making it only 20,000 voters, they have a stronger incentive to use their votes wisely, to think carefully about it, because their votes are they're not. It's not so personal that like you have a really strong interest. Desire to vote purely in your self-interest, but your vote matters more, so it makes more sense to think carefully about how you're voting, to talk to other people. And so perhaps this would improve voting on the margins by having a random number of people vote. And I often say, in many places, people are in favor of compulsory voting. Let's force everyone to vote. And one thing I often say in response to that is, every argument for compulsory voting is actually a better argument for this sortition-based system, randomly selecting people, because randomly selecting 20,000 Italians and having them and only them vote is more likely to reflect the will of the people as a whole than literally trying to force everyone to vote, because there's something called a counting error. The more people you have vote, the more mistakes you make in counting votes. And the counting error for having, say, in the United States, 210 million people vote is much higher than the statistical error rate of 20,000 people voting. So it's actually the better system. So here, those are a couple ideas where you're departing from what we're doing now, but instead of dispensing with democracy, you're trying to do what's good about democracy, but fix what's bad about it.
Well, in light of what we have heard, I asked myself a question, or actually ask it to you, Jason. Is voting today an expression of power? Is there any power in voting or not?
Yeah, voting is a classic collective action problem because how you vote doesn't matter and how we vote does, right? Similarly, climate change is a problem. If I decide to reduce the air conditioning in my house and drive a car that gets more miles per gallon, or decide to ride a bicycle to work and never drive again, that will not help anyone at all. I, as an individual consumer of carbon, have so little impact that my reducing my carbon emissions it won't save a single life. It won't make a difference. But what we do as a group makes a big difference. So similarly with voting, the probability that your vote will ever make any difference in any election is quite small. Again, since you're in Italy, you have a different voting system. It's higher than it is for me, but it's still very, very small. Voting is a little bit like playing the lottery. You're roughly as likely to win Euro millions as you are to change the outcome of, say, a congressional or a parliamentary election. And so, think of them as kind of like that. So no, individual votes are not really that powerful. People feel like they are, and we have the sense of that because one thing that happens in democracies is giving someone the right to vote is sort of a public affirmation of their standing and status. So just as an analogy, imagine a world like ours made up of people like us, but they don't have democracy, they have something else. But here's what happens. At age 18, the government gives you a red scarf, and you proudly wear your red scarf around the country. And the red scarf is a public affirmation that you are considered a full and equal member of that society. And now imagine, let's say, a new party comes to power that's very, fundamentalist and intolerant. And so they decide when they come to power, they no longer give red scarves to homosexuals. They're stripped of their red scarves. In that world, if that happened, we would march on the streets and demand that they get their red scarves back because the scarf is a public affirmation of your standing. But we sort of thinking about this as a thought experiment, we recognize there's nothing really about red scarves that inherently makes you equal. It's just the thing that culture happens to do to signify that you are a full member. So what we basically do with votes in modern democracies is treat them as if they were these red scarves. When countries become more tolerant and more accepting, when we want to sort of affirm that we think someone has standing, we give them the right to vote. When we want to give them, I won't stick on my middle finger. If we want to sort of express contempt for them, we might take away the right to vote, which is one reason why many countries, when you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote, which I don't support, by the way, but that's a very common practice. It's a way of saying, well, you're no longer a full member of our society. One of our methods of expressing contempt is to take your right to vote away. So that's sort of what voting is. It's this public, or the right to vote is often treated as a public affirmation of your standing, and thus having it feels empowering to people, even though they recognize how they vote will never make a difference.
Well, speaking of the voting right as a power, empowerment of voters, I remember that back in 2013, the president of the European Central Bank was asked a question about upcoming elections in Italy, and a journalist asked him whether the outcome of the elections in Italy could bring harm to the euro, to the single currency, whether or not the forthcoming Italian elections could bring about a change in government and policies that were incompatible with membership of the single currency. And the president of the European Central Bank at that time replied, no, because no matter what the Italian citizens actually vote for, the policies won't change because the economic policies, which is what really matters, at least what really matters to the single currency, have been already decided elsewhere. This may or may not be true to a certain extent, but what is absolutely true is that the president of the ECB is now Italy's prime minister. So in light of this, I think at least some Italian voters could legitimately feel that whatever they vote, it won't really change any policy that has been in place over the last years, simply not because politicians will break promises, but simply because whoever they elect in parliament, the economic policies and the economic policy agenda overall has been already decided in Brussels. And we have no control as citizens on what is being decided in Brussels or in the Euro summits. And probably voters in Spain, in Greece, and elsewhere in the European periphery feel the same. So this is, in my view, this is more, I understand this is more a European issue than it is an American issue, but this may contribute to skepticism of voters when they think about the right to vote and whether or not they are actually empowered by having the right to vote.
What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable because, I was saying before, your individual exercise of the franchise has little effect, but collectively it can have a big effect. But of course, you find in every political system, certain things are taken off the table and insulated from voters in general. And that's not always a bad thing. So the question of should we have democracy is a good question. There's also a question of which things should be subjected to democratic control. Everyone thinks something should be off the table. Which religion should you be? I don't think people should get to vote on that. Whom should you marry? Well, I mean, I think they can say you can't marry a 10-year-old, but once you're talking about consenting adults, that's off the table. They don't get to decide that. More complicated things are things like, you mentioned the central bank. Economists are pretty unanimous on this. You do not want democratic control of the central bank. And interestingly, politicians seem to know that. They seem to know that it's really dangerous if they are given that power because they know they'll abuse it. And so in most systems, you have something where the money supply, how much the money supply expands and so on, is insulated from politicians. And thank goodness they are. We have classic examples like in 1972, Nixon managed to pressure the Fed to expand the money supply a little bit too much. This is a kind of a failure of the Fed, and that led to a momentary boom and then a collapse afterwards. It was a bad move, and they kind of learned their lesson. So again, you don't really want even if you think you should have a democracy, not everything should be decided democratically. And there's reasons why almost every constitution in every country has certain things that are given over to, say, a judiciary branch of experts, or a legislative branch will create alphabet agencies that are made up of experts that have a lot of power, and the legislators only occasionally exercise control over them. They kind of push things off to the side, because sometimes it really matters that we get the answer right, and we need to just sort of create a system where the experts are to some degree incentivized to make that decision and have some degree of oversight. It is true, however, that as the European Union becomes more powerful and has more control over regulation and the nature of local economies, a lot of the things which are traditionally considered within the purview of voters that should be put to democratic control your relationship to that power is very tenuous. I expect that in the long term, there's going to be some sort of reform that will eliminate that, because you find almost universal dissatisfaction with this. Maybe outside of Germany, maybe Germans are okay with this. That's what I've noticed. But in France and Spain and elsewhere, the thing that you just said, everywhere else I go, people make that exact same complaint, except for Germany for some reason. So I suspect that for that reason, what will end up happening in the European Union over 30 or 40 years is that it will start looking more and more like the federal government of the United States. It will work as a federal system. Individual countries will look more and more like member states, and you'll have more voting power over what that federal government does. But I mean, I'm not going to bet on it. I think more likely than not that will happen, but I'm not going to go stake my fortune on this claim, because it's very hard to predict the future of politics.
Yes, probably if the European Commission will be elected, that might be a possibility to have this change in perception, but it seems as if we are managed by and governed by people that are not elected and in there just because they've been appointed. So this might be another moment and food for thought. But thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for this provocative and challenging conversation that we hope you have enjoyed. We surely did, and we hope that also that our audience has enjoyed. And we surely keep in touch. We surely be challenged by you again in the future. We really hope so. And now we would like to introduce the next shall we call Power of the Scary Beast event that will take place in November 18th. It will be with Mark Leddy, a co-chair of Clearly Gothic Steer at Hamilton, a real expert in competition. And we will talk about the power of competition, putting in parallel and making the differences between the approach to market competition that there is in the US and the regulation in there, and the one that there is in Europe. And in there, the topic of the European Commission and the power of the European Commission will come back on our plate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.